pandemic dealt a setback to learning for many students, but in urban areas such as Boston, the effects were more severe, especially for language learners, students with disabilities, and many other students with limited access to the internet. To help those students, the Boston School Fund will provide money for special programs, including grants to 5 schools in underserved neighborhoods. To tell us about the efforts is the fund's founder and CEO, Will Austin. I'd like to thank you very much for being with us, Will.
Thanks, Chris. Good to see you.
Well, I want to start with some of the things that you had to look at before you started making grants, and that is the kind of things that students need right now coming back from the pandemic. What were the main things you saw?
Yeah, so again, I appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk about this, Chris, and appreciate that you give voice to these really important issues. What we've said really since March of 2020 is that the pandemic did not cause the inequity we saw in the city. It just revealed and accelerated it. And so anything that we've seen where children or educators have struggled in the city, whether it's kids being on pace academically, kids having social and emotional supports, teachers having adequate resources and training, families getting adequate information about what's going on in schools, the crisis of the pandemic just increased the volume of those issues. And so as we kind of thought about where we could play a role, we felt like the most important thing we could do, as well as other nonprofits and other service providers, is to say, government did its job. It intervened. They got meals and Chromebooks and PPE and millions of dollars to these districts to make sure that kids and educators had what they needed in the crisis. But what comes next? As we kind of come back into being in school buildings and return to school, how can we make sure that kids, families, and educators have what they need, not just to recover, but really use the word recentering, because so much of what's happened in schools the last couple of years has not been about learning, about kids' development. It's been about how many desks can you fit in a room and how many pooled tests you have to do a day. And as we move away from that, we want to make sure that we're recentering on kids and educators' needs.
Well, just to give an example of what that could mean, I think there's one school in Mattapan, the Taylor School. They want to pay more attention to social and emotional needs and inquiry-based learning. So how do those help students recenter?
Well, first of all, you got to take kids' temperature, to pardon the anecdote, right? Kids had been in and out of school buildings. Many kids have lost services during that time. And so in a lot of ways, we have to assume that some kids or many kids have arrested development. So the first step that we need capacity for is to assess the kids from a social emotional learning perspective, whether this through additional counseling or through software or through different interventions. The first step is to say, of my 300 to 400 kids, how are they? Who needs help? And then when you've actually taken that step of identifying who needs help and what, then you can mix and match the resources necessary. And so that's why we felt like it was really important to get our recentering grants out now, because even though there's this $450 million of federal funds heading towards Boston Public Schools, they haven't hit classrooms yet. And so what we want to do is make sure that these schools develop the capacity to get ready, to get themselves lined up so that when that infusion of dollars comes, that they only accelerates resources for kids and educators.
What about the students who've practically fallen off the grid altogether? What about helping them?
Well, I think, it's very clear from the public data that enrollment has declined in Boston, not just Boston Public Schools, but all Boston schools now have less kids in them than they did a year ago by a pretty significant amount. And so the first step really in the fall is going to get a sense of where kids are. There's been a lot of national reporting about whether or not kids are being undercounted or moving. And so the first step in all this really has to be who are our kids and who can we serve? That's kind of the first step. In terms of re-engaging kids that have been not in school for a very long time, that's where the value of having additional grant dollars and federal dollars come in. You need additional staff to track down kids, communicate with families, get kids back into school buildings, build trust. It's a good example in education of where having a policy idea or an initiative isn't enough. It's going to take people and it's going to take time.
Well, whenever we hear a lot of federal dollars, and I think in this state, maybe we're talking about something like 400 million.
Yeah.
It sounds like great news, but on the other hand, how do you get to how that money is spent and who makes the decisions?
Yeah, and it's such a massive number for us to comprehend. So the way that we try to kind of break it down for folks and myself is that imagine that every kid in the city of Boston just got a stimulus check. That kid and family is getting a stimulus check for about $9,000 over the next couple of years. So the question should be, if you're a child, if you're a family, you should see $9,000 of resources in your child's schools and classrooms in the coming years, right? So that's kind of the test of this. We're going to put all this money in, then we should see what that means for kids and educators in classrooms. At least that's the way that we think about it. And then in terms of who decides, we feel pretty clear about it. And this isn't, I don't even think, a policy stance or philosophical one. It's just a practical one. Schools should decide because they have the most data. They know their kids, they know their teachers, they know their school buildings. And so as much money as possible has to go directly to schools and classrooms. And so, it's something we've heard Boston Public Schools speak about publicly, that they want to set a target for a percentage of dollars to go to schools. And it is our kind of advice that it definitely does not drop below 50%, that 50% or more of these federal dollars have to find their ways to classrooms and classrooms fast.
I want to ask you about some of the other strategies that are needed at this moment as the schools trend back toward normal, or maybe to a new normal. What about community engagement, parent engagement? They have to do some things different now?
Yeah, and I think that starts with the process we just talked about, Chris. I think that as schools over the next couple of months make plans for how they spend money at the school level, families have to be a part of that decision-making process, whether it's through parent councils or school site councils. There's a direct role for families and communities to play in how this money gets spent at the school level. I think that's one. Number two, I think that as we kind of move beyond kind of this return to schools, there's this question around what do we want to have happen next? And it's really interesting. There's tons of local and national polling data that says that families have an appetite for innovation now, that once they kind of get back, they want to understand and contribute to ways that schools could be the same or different going forward. I'll give one kind of really simple example where there's been wide consensus, but we've been unable to do it here. It's start times. If you talk to any educator or any child psychologist, they will tell you that high school kids getting up to go to school at 5:45 a.m. when it's dark is one of the worst things you can do for their development in brains. If we're back in September and we're doing something we know that does not work for kids after they've been out of buildings for a year, then we have missed an opportunity to innovate. And so I think that families really want to not just be part of the recentering process, but I think they have some pretty strong ideas about how the system might have to adapt.
Well, if you look back at some of these makeshift adjustments during the pandemic, there's one which is the proliferation of learning pods even in the city. It looks like it has some promise. Do you see that sticking around going into the future?
It's unclear to me. I mean, so the state last week released data on enrollment of kids in all cities and towns in Massachusetts by school type. And although there's been a lot of interest in the concept of homeschooling or pods, there hasn't been that dramatic increase in the number of kids actually in them. It's actually pretty marginal, only like 100 or 200 kids in the whole city. I think that there are some subset of families and kids for which remote learning or hybrid learning was a significantly more effective practice for them. For that very small specific group, I think that there'll be ways to kind of consider how that can continue. But, just to plan it really simple, like school works for most kids, or at least it should. And so the vast majority of kids and educators will be back in school buildings in the way they have been before.
What about elements of those pods is an after school program?
Yeah, and I come back to this question of innovation. We have most schools in Boston have a 6-hour and 45-minute day. Chris, I know that you and other working parents are listening to this. I'm sure you work more than 6 hours and 45 minutes a day. And so there's a big question over time about how the school day should be structured and how it adapts to what our modern needs are around childcare, especially for younger kids. Another thing that folks are really interested in is summer. I mean, a lot of families may not want a longer school day for a variety of reasons, but there's a wide consensus they want more summer enrichment activities and summer learning opportunities. And so I think that's another kind of innovation that we will hear more about from families.
You've been doing work in the fund for a while now. And is there anything you can say about things that you've tried and show a difference between what works and what does not work?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. And, having done this for 6 years and having worked with 38 schools directly, and I think visiting 90 or so, I've really had the opportunity to see really every type of school in the city. And, it's not so much that the programs matter. Like I could say that Boston International Newcomers Academy, which does work exclusively with kids who are newest Bostonians who don't speak English, but then finds a way to accelerate them and get them to high school graduation, is structured very differently from Edward Brooks High School or very differently from New Mission High School. The thing that ties all these things together are pretty simple. One is schools, the schools are viable. And what I mean by viable is it means that families want to send their kids there, and those schools have the resources they need to produce the program they want. They're not running around for fundraising. They're not kind of jumping onto fads or initiatives. They have a program that they understand and that they can roll to and they can fund. And two, and this is going to sound a little mystical, they know who they are. They've chosen an academic path. They've chosen a cultural path for that school, and principals, educators, families, and kids have chosen that path, whether it's dual language, whether it is something that's a little more traditional, whether it is something that involves arts, but everyone there has chosen a certain academic and cultural program, and it's been consistent over time, even through leadership changes. People matter. Last thing I would say, you have the best ideas in the world, but if you don't got great school leaders, you don't have great teachers, then the outcomes aren't there for kids. And so viable program, something consistent, a culture in the program that everyone agrees with, and then great people. And that includes families and kids, is how you get there.
Well, I want to ask you about one more thing. At the fund, you've been circulating some open-ended guidelines about the recovery strategy for schools. What's the main purpose there?
Yeah, so the main purpose there, Chris, is that you can't be one size fits all in this stuff. I think not just in education, but specifically in the recovery from the pandemic. The needs of kids are too diverse and frankly too inequitable. The pandemic has affected more kids more than others to say this is the one way we're going to support schools and school communities to recover. And so more so what we wanted to provide to school communities was two things: guidelines, as you said, not saying that we have the answer for your school community, but if this is the thing you want to do, here are some evidence-based practices and here are some basic resources for you to go do that. And then connected to that, educators and families are tired. They've spent the last year making plans, changing plans, moving plans, responding to events. We felt that what folks wanted from our engagement with our 38 schools is they wanted things they could just use. They didn't want another planning process. They didn't want another time where they had to figure things out. They wanted tools and resources they could just apply very quickly. And so given that we had the capacity to do that, we developed a guide for them.
Well, if people want to look at that, I imagine you have that on your website. So where should they go?
They can go to our website, bostonschoolsfund.org, and also they could go to edrecenter.org. It's interactive. It is free. Anyone can use it. And if you have questions about it, just reach out to our website.
Thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Be well.
You too. Will Austin from the Boston School Fund. We'll have more news in just a moment.